Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Panama Papers have claimed their first scalp, a big one. The Prime Minister of Iceland, Sigmundur Gunnarsson, who, the papers revealed, set up a company in the British Virgin Islands with his wife and then, when he entered Parliament, failed to declare it. Our own Prime Minister, who had been under pressure over the revelation of his late father's involvement in a Panama-based fund for investors, today insisted he had no shares, no offshore trusts and no offshore funds. It is the central role which British dependencies have played in what Jeremy Corbyn today called the encouragement of tax avoidance on an industrial scale that led him to echo the call made by the former Business Secretary Vince Cable on Newsnight last night for the imposition of direct rule on British overseas territories and Crown dependencies. Here's our policy editor, Chris Cook.
The Panama Papers have claimed their first big scalp. A crowd here in Reykjavik have been demanding the resignation of Sigmundur Gunnarsson, Iceland's Prime Minister. A few days ago, he was dismissing claims that he'd hidden wealth offshore in Panama. Today, he quit over the scandal. His finance minister, also implicated, is still hanging on. David Cameron has come in for some heat too. His late father, who worked in finance, used Panama as well.
I own no shares. I have a salary as Prime Minister and I have some savings which I get some interest from, and I have a house which we used to live in, which we now let out while we're living in Downing Street, and that's all I have. I have no shares, no offshore trusts, no offshore funds, nothing like that.
The Labour leader focused today not on Panama, but on some of the British 14 overseas territories, the former Crown colonies still dependent on the UK. Many of the overseas territories, like the Falklands or Montserrat, have not become financial centres. Others, though, have made their way onto lists of tax havens. So there's particular attention on Bermuda in the Atlantic, the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean, and Gibraltar in Europe. These territories are accused of enabling excessive secrecy, of the sort that allowed the Icelandic Prime Minister to keep his investments hidden in Panama.
You can go to the British Virgin Islands, for example, as a classic case where you can incorporate a company very cheaply there, and you can then, that company can then own assets. And even though you, the rich person, are the beneficial owner of that company, you can put nominees in the way. So if you go to the British Virgin Islands and try and find out more about that company, and I've done this myself, you bang your head against a brick wall.
So to give you a sense of what this secrecy means on the ground, here is a company filing from the British Virgin Islands. It's for a company called LW Group Limited, company number 350578. And what it tells you is the name of the lawyers who set up the company and their address. It tells you the name of the company's current lawyers and their address. What it doesn't tell you is that this company actually is the owner of a number of large British companies, namely Yodel, the delivery company, and Littlewoods, the shop. It also doesn't tell you who the shareholders are. In this case, it's the Barclay brothers. We can work out from filings elsewhere what the Barclay Brothers company is, but other owners have stayed off the radar. So what can the Foreign Office do? Mr Corbyn alluded to the fact that, in 2009, London imposed direct rule on the Turks and Caicos Islands because of local corruption. He suggested the Foreign Office could do the same for overseas territories who don't play ball on secrecy. Actually, though, it's more likely they'd use another power. So the Foreign Office's final big lever is legal. It can pass laws or orders in council through the Privy Council that will force the overseas territories into line. That, of course, relies on the overseas territories doing as they're told and not declaring independence. Some of the bigger overseas territories, notably Bermuda, might be tempted by that path. The Foreign Office considers this a nuclear option. They'd prefer to chivvy, encourage and use little bargaining chips. Diplomatic and public pressure is their current preferred weapon.
Panama has been seen as just, a bunch of, banana republic kind of a place, and people can dismiss that. But we are intimately involved in this issue, in this problem. We in Britain and in Europe, there are a lot of European tax havens, United States as well. The rich world is part of the problem. That's where the tax havens are. You aren't going to stash your money in somewhere like Nigeria. You're going to stash it in somewhere rich and developed.
One thing has become clear: island tax havens are only one corner of the controversy around tax.
Chris Cook. Well, earlier this evening, I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Bermuda, Bob Richards, and asked him what he says to Jeremy Corbyn's suggestion today that places like Bermuda should be brought under direct rule.
Well, I would say that Bermuda is a country that has its own constitution. We have a democratically elected government that operates under the rule of law, under the Constitution. And the Constitution is an agreed document with the United Kingdom government. And we would not expect the United Kingdom, a government that has great respect for the rule of law, to breach their own covenants.
But how do you justify, for example, to British taxpayers that you provide a place for people to hide the tax that they are due to pay in the countries where they are based?
That's a question based on a false assumption. We have our own laws on our own taxes. And every company that incorporates in Bermuda has to provide the government agency, which is the Bermuda Monetary Authority, the names of the beneficial owners of those companies. And that includes trusts as well. And it's a register called a beneficial ownership register.
Yes, you provide the information, but you don't deny that they are not paying the taxes that they're due to pay in their own country, for example, Britain.
Well, if the British authorities think that some Briton, has a company in Bermuda and they're not paying their taxes, we will assist the UK government. Well, your government's laws, taxes are for them. The only thing that we can do is to cooperate and assist with you when asked through the proper channels.
Why do you think that in 2013, David Cameron said to Bermuda that you had to get your house in order?
Well, I think that he misspoke, quite frankly, because insofar as this is concerned, the UK is planning to construct a beneficial ownership registry. I'm sure that you know that. The facts are that Bermuda has had such a registry for 70 years, 70 years.
Yes, and, but it doesn't mean you're not a tax haven, does it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Bermudians pay taxes. Companies in Bermuda pay taxes. I'm the tax man. I'm the finance minister. So I can tell you that the taxes in Bermuda come to about 17 or 18% of GDP. So we pay taxes. And every time I put up taxes, I get howls of complaints from residents, as I did in this budget session. So the notion that we can run a country, run a government with no taxes is not really realistic.
Do you put yourself in a different bracket from the British Virgin Islands, for example, and the Caymans?
I'm not going to comment on other overseas territories. The only thing I can say to you is this, that there seems to be a tendency on the part of not just the UK, but the UK included, and other countries, to treat all overseas territories the same. One size fits all. I can tell you categorically that one size does not fit all. The constitutions of those islands that you mentioned are different from Bermuda. We have a very higher level of self-government than they do. And from the beginning, from 1947, our forebears had the notion that we didn't want just anybody doing business in Bermuda. We would screen them and approve them and discard the ones that didn't meet our standards. And that's the reason that you do not see Bermuda mentioned in those Panama Papers. By the way, I have to remind you that the UK is mentioned in those Panama Papers, but not Bermuda.
Bob Richards, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, joining me now from Cardiff is Chris Bryant, Labour MP, who was the minister responsible the last time we took powers away from a Crown dependency when the British government imposed direct rule in the Turks and Caicos Islands in March 2009. Though in that instance, it was to do with a corruption scandal. Good evening, Chris Bryant.
Good evening. What a load of baloney you've just heard.
Well, I'm
afraid because Bermuda certainly has no income tax, has no property tax, has no sales tax, has no inheritance tax. It is a tax haven. And the whole point of having, the way some overseas territories have constructed their tax regime is not just to be competitive, but is to attract people to try and hide their international assets there.
Right. So do you agree with Jeremy Corbyn, then, that direct rule should be imposed on the territories and dependencies?
Well, the one thing that was just said that is right is that we shouldn't treat all the overseas territories in exactly the same way.
But Bermuda, you've just criticised Bermuda. Should there be direct rule for Bermuda?
Not tomorrow, no, there shouldn't. Because I think there are plenty of other powers that the UK government already has, which it is, for some bizarre reason, for the last 6 years, it's been choosing not to exercise.
So is Jeremy Corbyn wrong
for instance,
to lump... Sorry to interrupt,
no,
I just want to clarify that position.
Yep.
Is Jeremy Corbyn wrong to lump them all together?
He hasn't lumped them all together. We're not saying that you should suddenly install direct rule over Pitcairn or the Falklands Islands or the British Indian Ocean Territory. But the point is here is really important because, for instance, in Turks and Caicos, the cabinet is still chaired by the British governor. All legislation has to receive royal assent because they're part of the British Crown. So there are plenty of powers that the government had. So let me just give you one instance. When I was the Foreign Office Minister in 2009, 2010, several of the financial services overseas territories, which Jeremy is absolutely right to point to, they were in significant financial problems and they needed to borrow a lot of money. In particular, British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos. I refused to allow them to borrow more money. They needed permission from the UK. I refused to allow them to borrow more money until such time as they brought in some broader tax basis, because it's one thing to try and have a competitive tax regime. I fully get that. But it's quite another to have a set of rules which means you can hide the beneficial ownership of significant assets from the rest of the world. And it's worth bearing in mind that 8% of the world's wealth is kept hidden.
Let's be clear that a lot of what is being reviewed and will still to be reviewed in the Panama Papers was during Labour's watch. So this has been a long-standing problem.
I agree.
What I'm asking you now is that it's not one size fits all, but let's say, for example, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, is there an argument for taking them under direct rule now, and how would you do it?
I think, well, if we want to do it, all you have to do is you have to present an order in council. It's a pretty straightforward process. But I would say that it's. Sorry, I think you're talking over me and I can't hear you then.
The implications of doing it, what would the implications be?
They'd be dramatic. I think that would be the nuclear option. And what I would say is that you need to use all the other powers. And I'm mystified by why the Conservative government in 2010, or the coalition government when it came in 2010, decided to allow all the borrowing to go forward for all those other countries without requiring them to move forward on transparency. And the one point, incidentally, in relation to Bermuda, which is absolutely key, is it's all very well to gather the information within Bermuda on beneficial ownership, but you need to share that between all the different dependencies, overseas territories and the UK government, so that you can make sure that you're doing it properly. And in the end, because, you know, my constituents, they spit with fury when they hear that there's one set of rules for the ultra rich and there's another set of rules for everybody else. Everybody else has to pay their fair share of tax. Why shouldn't these big corporations? And why should Putin be able, or Poroshenko or whoever, be able to hide ownership of properties through companies in BVI? Or for that matter, why should we in the UK not be able to know that the President of the United Arab Emirates owns vast chunks of London's property market?
Thank you very much for that, Chris Bryant.